One of the things that the birthing room image enables you to do is to present textiles, to present clothing, bed covering, different kinds of linens for the baby, and to represent those as discrete from each other. They're demarcated for different kinds of uses. From the late Middle Ages, we have amazing birth girdles. So the Wellcome has one English one and two French ones, and these represent a religious response really to the problem of childbirth, which is obviously, something that people anticipated with a certain amount of concern. Women often wrote their wills before they went to give birth or before their expected time, and so these birth girdles really include prayers. This one has the life of St. Margaret, who is a saint who represents childbirth, and it gives women some kind of confidence they might be protected in a religious way. It was a devotional response, if you like, to something that they often feared, I'm sure. So this is the earliest one, isn't it? We've got for today.
Yeah.
And as you can see, it's being kept in this way because it's so fragile, and so. But you can definitely see the size of it. So you can see inside there is a scroll of parchment, and this one is 15th century, and it has on it a life of St. Margaret, so a saint's life, and she's the saint who, one of the tortures that she's subjected to is she's swallowed by Satan in the guise of a dragon, and she bursts out of his stomach. And so a lot of the images of her look as if she's being born from this animal. And so that's an extremely special object which you have here.
We can see the scale of it. So we can see this is the width of it, and it's a pretty narrow artefact. But it's very long, and so
it would have been wrapped around several times around the belly.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is that we get into the realm of talismans and amulets, and the idea that a material object is imbued with certain properties that will pass to the human body when there's direct physical contact between the object and the body.
Do so few of them survive because they're quite delicate, because the parchment is quite ephemeral?
So it's such an interesting question, because so this is an example. This particular one is lacking the first section, and so it seems like the parchment was torn off. So that does suggest damage through use. But at the same time, parchment was very strong, and so you could imagine durability. You can imagine that these things would have survived, except for the fact that they were used repeatedly. So that would be, I think, the key reason why they would disappear ultimately.
Aren't they also targets for iconoclasts? Because what you've got, I suppose, particularly in England, that they've got iconography of different kinds, but also, particularly Marian devotional material. Which is difficult, isn't it?
You're absolutely right about iconoclasm, and the sense that at a certain point in time, after the Reformation or in the wake of the Reformation, there was an active kind of instinctive destruction of these, and that if you had one in your possession, you might seek to hide it or destroy it.
People are surrounded not only by material culture, but by material culture of particular power, and that's assembled in the images. So the idea that the sacred parts of a culture aren't brought to bear on childbirth was something that was honoured much more in the aspiration, I think, than in the actual absence of what we might construe as saturated talisman, as well as other objects in the birthing room.
Shall I find the page that I was after? So this is a 17th century recipe book owned by a woman called Jane Jackson. And what's amazing about it is that it has both medical recipes for various ailments, but also to increase fertility, alongside culinary recipes. So we don't know a huge amount about who Jane Jackson was, and we don't know a huge amount about how she compiled it and whether or not these recipes were all put into use. But we can certainly see the cultural value that's placed on fertility. So here there's almost 2 pages just of recipes to increase the likelihood of conceiving. So this one here, for example, that goes over to this page is a recipe involving various ingredients that you mix together, and that the husband is instructed to anoint his yard or penis with before sex in order to increase the likelihood of conceiving. So this is a 1725 edition of a text that was originally published in 1671 by a midwife, Jane Sharp. And this one has this beautiful frontispiece. So the top level depicts the birthing room. You can see the infant in the cradle there. And it's a little bit unfortunately obscured, but this is a bed with the newly delivered woman in the bed, and presumably a midwife or nurse attending to her. This middle panel depicts baptism. You can see the child being carried in baptismal robes to church, and the procession behind, although it could also be a gesture to the older practice of churching after childbirth, which is a religious ceremony that women underwent about a month after childbirth, although probably by 1725 that was less a common practice. And the bottom panel here sort of depicts the feasting that often accompanies childbirth. And we can see that while the birthing room is very much a female space, both the baptism and this kind of more convivial culture surrounding childbirth was one that involved both men and women. And I think that's something to remember when we're thinking about the birthing room, that other family members may not have been present, but they certainly informed the experience.
So what these images often represent is a very aspirational space. You know, we don't really know exactly what the birthing room was like, you know, and of course there would have been a multiplicity of experience in those, just as there is today for women giving birth. In some ways you might want to say that they're images of an interior, perhaps more than a birthing room. They borrow a lot of their ideas, if you like, about how figures are placed in space and what they're wearing, from perhaps particularly devotional images, but also other images of family. You know, what we've got here is something which is using that scene as a pretext, if you like, to present beautiful objects, specialised furniture, specialised linen, and also the personnel of the household, so that this mid-17th century image is absolutely packed with people, unlike perhaps some earlier images. And you can see that some of those people are intended to represent professionals. We've got a wise woman depicted, but also some friends, perhaps also servants, and surprisingly perhaps for an image of this date, a husband is quite clearly picked out in the inscriptions at the bottom, and he's kind of pointing proudly at the baby emerging from between this lady's clothes, and so it in some ways it looks very graphic to us, surprising in many ways, you know, and yet clearly it was something which was perceived to be very desirable. So this is quite an interesting mid-17th century French depiction of a birthing room, of course very idealised, but we've actually got here the baby emerging from this, you know, kind of draped figure on the bed, who's being kind of held very assiduously, you know, very tenderly by these female attendants.
same time, it's a really wealthy birthing room, and you've got everything perfectly set up with the great big windows so everyone can really see what's going on, and the fire, which is really important. It was thought that everybody had to be nice and warm. But there's maybe a sign that the midwife has come from the street, that she's got her hat and shoes dropped.
Yeah,
So there's always a certain urgency acknowledged in the...
And then this here we assume is the midwife's kit, that with her what in England in this period are called clouts, so pieces of fabric for various kinds of uses. It's clearly a very opulent scene, isn't it? But they've even got a special stand for the box, the midwife's box, and the kind of the embroidering over the bed as well in sumptuous fabrics.
Somebody leaning over here, pushing the linen up, sort of ready to take the baby, I think.
So one of the great sources of information about childbirth in the early modern period is printed childbearing guides, which this is a really early one from the 1540s, one of the first that's translated into English. But after this time, get a real boom in the publication of childbearing guides, and they become very popular. And we're not always sure entirely whether people are using them to understand childbirth. There's often a question about whether or not people are interested in more salacious content within these volumes. But they have information about the genitals of men and women. So here we have an image of female genitalia in Roslin's text. But they also have lots of information about how to get pregnant, how to stay pregnant, conduct and diet during pregnancy, the different positions that babies might be in the womb, which is informative for midwives as well, in directing delivery. And then they also have all of this information about restoring health after childbirth for women and for babies as well. So this midwives manual has images of babies in the womb. So here we also have twins. And some historians have said that that perhaps to a modern audience they might seem quite unrealistic, quite stylized, the images of the womb, and particularly the babies seem almost fully grown, quite animated in them. But there's a suggestion that they may have provided a real kind of tool for midwives in understanding how to deliver babies that were in more complicated positions for delivery, and also potentially sort of reassured women about birth. These are very healthy big babies, and they look as if they would be quite easy to deliver. I think one of the interesting things is quite how small this book is as well, which suggests that potentially it was portable and that may have been used by midwives to take to different births. I think this is particularly obvious in contrast to the much, much larger domestic recipe book compiled by Jane Jackson.
Something we notice about the images they've chosen to stick in is that each of them suggests a relationship between inside and outside of the body, which is so important for people giving birth and for people helping others to give birth. And often, I don't know if this is an accurate thing, but often when I look at these, I think about that relationship from the point of view of the different participants in the event. So the mother, but also the midwife, and in an emergency, the doctor. And the idea that the baby has to come out, and sometimes instruments and hands have to go up, seems to be something that's implicit in a lot of these images.
So this is an incredibly interesting German version of Roslin's Rose Garden, which has these amazing print woodcuts in, and this is one of a contemporary birthing stool to illustrate, how that would be used, and describes how to use it. And at the same time, we see again these fetal images of malpresentation at birth. So obviously this one is the ideal presentation, whereas these are breech babies. And these fetal figures are often represented as male, as you can see here. But again, these slightly more awkward positions, which might present a particular challenge. In this book, we also have a contemporary image of women supporting a woman to give birth on a birthing stool. So we sort of see it in action. This is an example of the sort of image which is borrowing from depictions of the Virgin Mary. You can see this particularly kind of animated foot, and the use of folded textiles to indicate a kind of sort of trinity, if you like, of figures. And so it's definitely borrowing from that kind of devotional aesthetic with these women with these head dresses on, which invariably you do see in these kinds of birthing room depictions.
It's incredible for us in the 21st century to still have these materials, and we can ask questions about them that relate to our own experiences today, and that can actually, I think, looking at these objects can remind us of what a vulnerable moment childbirth is, of how fundamental a moment it is in the life cycle, and of how people throughout all periods of history have paid great attention to this moment, and it has always been a collaborative moment where families and communities have come together.
I think the birthing room, from my perspective, is a theatre that constellates a number of different people that I find very interesting and puts them all, if not physically, at least relationally and in imagination, in the same physical space. So for me, particularly, it brings together a group of people that include two categories I'm very interested in. Non-elite women, so women who are quite far away from even aspiring to be in the scenes that we see in the illustrations. And another group, which is midwives, who work and are called to the room and need to get there in time and do their work to produce a healthy mother and a healthy baby. So they were very local, and they would work, for example, for the parish. So in the case of servant women or servant girls who had become pregnant and who were delivering, it was important to have a midwife there. She was supposed to perform particular functions, some of which were for the woman. She was supposed to successfully deliver the baby. But, and this is something that is quite famous about these midwives, she was supposed to ask the girl or woman who the father of the child was in order that it could be paid for by the parish. And this false testimony is something that is recorded, if not in those women's own words, in the words of people making accounts of those scenes. So we do know something about the life experience of those women from those different kinds of accounts. At the same time, midwives were supposed to deliver anyone, rather like a doctor's Hippocratic oath. They were supposed to deliver humans. And so were doctors if they were needed. So in many of the case studies and the accounts, there are particular birthing stories that give us glimpses of women. So the one I found furthest down the social scale have been prostitutes, which people are particularly interested in because they might have diseases and be giving birth. But we have accounts also of where they were living and how they were found. And a vagrant woman who was herself some kind of apothecary, so a travelling woman, who, on the one hand, sold somebody a lot of things that weren't good for them, and on the other hand, delivered her own baby successfully. So we really get some quite long stories about women that aren't actually criminal, but are telling us quite a lot about their relationship to the life cycle. It's interesting that in the images we're looking at today, midwives feature quite prominently receiving the babies, and in the French illustration, down at the front, right at the front of the image, receiving the baby. So the midwife is at the front and she's a physical presence in that image, but all the sacred powers of that society, money, textiles,
the images of the saints on the walls surround her, really, and her important role. And so the woman is prone, and the active person in that image is the midwife. And that's an interesting image of a woman in that period, and takes us, I think, to the other evidence we have, apart from images, that are about midwives, which is their licenses. And midwives are unusual in being an acknowledged occupation or profession, and having, in London at least, a long-standing licensing structure, initially through the church, and which involved accreditation apparently by people who had used them, and a 7-year training period. So they are a very interesting category of women, and because of their professionalisation, have generated things like case books of their own cases and records of testimonies. In fact, there was one woman who had assembled all her witnesses to become a senior midwife and have her license. But she was so busy practicing that there was an emergency and she couldn't get to her own licensing ceremony. So they're a very interesting set of women about whom records exist, and who were medical workers of a very important and key kind from very early on. And importantly, not only were they that, but they were recognised as such legally in some cases.
I mean, one of the amazing things that these birthing scenes do is really visualize a lot of the advice that are in the accompanying chapters on what to do after birth medically. And so we can see from these images that there are very separate medical tasks that are meant to be done for both women after they've given birth and for newborn babies. So more elite households would often have hired both a midwife for the woman and a nurse for the child. And the nurse was to take the baby, inspect to see whether anything was wrong with the body, ensure it cried, and to clear its airways if they were blocked. And then to bathe the baby in hot water, rub its body. One of the reasons for that is they're very concerned about the period of pregnancy causing a kind of a blockage in the child that needs to be cleared afterwards. So the bath helps to, the heat of the bath helps to encourage the process of excretion, and the rubbing as well. And then the baby is swaddled in bands, which are actually quite tight. And perhaps a modern viewer might perceive that as being injurious to infant health, but for early modern people, this was believed to be absolutely crucial in order to ensure your baby survived. It allowed the limbs to grow straight, because they think that newborn babies have very kind of flexible, wax-like limbs and bodies. And for women, there's a whole separate regimen of care, delivering the afterbirth, ensuring that bleeding continues for up to 30 days after childbirth, and remaining in the bed for up to a week after birth. But of course, we know that in less elite households, probably this period of a week in bed and a month away from normal domestic tasks would have been impossible for those who were dependent on an income. By considering the birthing room, we also are able to access certain kind of bigger questions about how people understood the body in the past, how they understood health and the importance that they placed on that, the kinds of decisions they made about medical practitioners, who they were going to hire, and also what kinds of care they were seeking in order to ensure mother and baby were as healthy as possible. It also reveals a lot about family dynamics and about gender roles, that the birthing room, as we can see from these images, was a wholly female space most of the time. But that doesn't mean that family weren't involved, that we can see in the frontispiece from the 1725 edition of Jane Sharp's Midwives book, that the top scene of birth is just women, the midwife and the woman in the bed, potentially a nurse and maybe a friend, also known as a gossip. But the other two panels, which represent baptism and also the feasting that surrounds the moment of birth, very much involve men and other family members.